Okay, today we're going to talk about really the run-up or the connection between the end of the War with Mexico and the bringing in of all this land into the United States, running into the early 1850s, because the 1850s become a political catastrophe for the United States society and government. And problems arise, arguments arise that just are never solved, and that directly lead to the Civil War. So today it's important to talk about this question of slavery in the United States that had been part of the early United States ever since the American Revolution, since the Declaration of Independence, and since the original writing of the Constitution. So this question of whether slavery should be expanded to cover the entire United States, which by 1848 now had spanned the entire continent, or large parts of the North American continent, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The war with Mexico opened the gigantic problem again. Is the United States going to be a slave-based economy and therefore a pro-slavery country? Or is it going to eliminate slavery step by step throughout the entire country? That is the major question that never gets solved, and that eventually the Civil War gets fought completely over. And that's the major debate. So today is intended to connect the problem of bringing all this land into the slavery debate and set up a lot of the arguments and a lot of the major political problems in the 1850s. And it gets pretty chaotic in the 50s. So first I want to go back to the original map of the United States. In about the year 1800, this is what the United States looked like. It was an Atlantic coastline country, basically. From the Treaty of 1783 that ended the American Revolutionary War against Britain, the United States took a lot of land all the way to the Mississippi River, going all the way up to the British colony in Canada. So that's the original map of the United States coming out of the Revolution. The United States in 1803 had somewhere around 6 million people in it, so it was a fairly populated country. There's also a lot of open countryside, especially once you cross the Appalachian Mountains, which really separate the eastern seaboard, the eastern coastline, from the interior countryside, the major farmlands. That ended up being a whole lot of what the American government considered to be open farmland, but of course there's native tribes and whatnot still in those areas. And this is what the United States looks like in 1840. Taking in the Louisiana Purchase territory, eventually taking in the Oregon country, had taken Florida from Spain in the 18-teens. So this is what the United States looks like on the cusp of the war with Mexico. And of course, when they go to war with Mexico, they conquer a whole lot more land all the way to the Pacific. So by 1844, 1845, that is what the country looks like. You have a massive growth in territory. The United States in the war with Mexico took in about 500,000 square miles just by itself. That is a gigantic growth. The United States population also grew by the 1850s from 6 million in 1803, I think the year is 1853, where they grow to about 26 million. So the population size quadruples. And that was for a lot of different reasons. Largely immigration from Europe very much sped up in the 1830s and 1840s. But you can see that the land size of the United States virtually triples from 1800 to 1850. The population literally quadruples. So the United States has a whole lot more people. And the U.S. economy is 7 times larger in 1850 than it was in 1800. So you have growth on 3 different levels. The United States is growing like crazy. It's one of the profoundly expanding countries of the 1800s. The first half of the 1800s at least. In the European kind of Western civilization type of culture. The United States is growing by leaps and bounds in these 3 different ways. And one of the major reasons, especially for the economic growth, was the growth in the slave, not just the slave trade, but the economics of slavery, especially regarding the growth of tobacco and cotton, and particularly in the South. Many northern states had begun outlawing slavery in the 18 teens, and so about by 1820 or so, most of the northern states, north of Virginia, had outlawed slavery on the state level. But the southern states did not. So you had a political split, an economic split, and a cultural split in the country that emerges in around the 1820s, where many people start viewing themselves more as northerners and southerners than as westerners versus easterners, or as bankers versus farmers, the old kind of divisions that had prevailed in the 1790s under Jefferson and Hamilton's kind of early political battles and the rise of the first political parties. A lot of people had believed the economics of slavery was getting to the point where buying new slaves or getting a hold of new slaves somehow wasn't all that economically useful in the late 1700s. They were becoming very expensive to buy and to house and to feed and keep them alive as a workforce. One of the problems was that it's, when even if you have a whole lot of slaves, it takes a long time, especially with growing cotton, for them to literally go through the cotton plants that are growing and pick cotton out. Cotton plants have thorns and such, so it's a very difficult, slow, and painful type of labor. And a lot of Southerners had begun to question by the late 1700s whether it's even really worth it to invest in increasing amounts of slavery because they're just not making as much money per slave as they used to. So there's a lot of predictions in the 1700s that slavery would just die as an economic entity as big slave owners start going bankrupt. So there's a great hope that that would happen. That does not happen because one inventive guy comes up with an engine, which he called a gin. But it's literally a cotton separation engine. So the Industrial Revolution brings up a new invention to make the separation of cotton, the raw cotton, the kind of cotton lint, from the plant much easier. So whoever is growing cotton, whoever is doing the actual physical work in the United States, in the southern United States, often slaves, they would not have to bend over and literally pick the raw cotton out of the plant. They would instead go through and tear off parts of the plant and just put it into a large basket or whatever large carrying object that they have on hand, some kind of wheelbarrow or something. And they would take it to the engine, and they would literally take just the chunks of the plant and put it in one side of the engine, and it would have these steel teeth that would literally pull the raw cotton from the plant and separate it automatically by machine, which means it could, these engines could run on a constant basis. They could work much faster. And sometimes you would lose a lot of the raw cotton just in the pulling, the separation process. So a lot of it would just be thrown in the trash. But the amount that you get that's separated and cured, and the speed that you get it, is greatly increased from just having people do it by hand. So many economists and many historians argue that the cotton gin really brought slavery back and made it economically feasible again for especially large slave owners, and especially in the southern United States, just because it made cotton production much more efficient. Therefore, you could make, if you buy one of these machines and just a few slaves or a few workers, even if you're paying them a wage, you could still make a lot of money. And cotton growth explodes in the American South to the point where it starts to be referred to as King Cotton in the South. cotton becomes, along with tobacco, the two major southern exports. So those are the two major things that the South is growing to make money. And because in the South, the big rich people are still the big landowners, you usually get the wealthy and the politically powerful are plantation owners in the South. Those are the big businesses of the time in the American South. Plantations are often thousands and thousands of acres in size, and plantation owners would often own hundreds of slaves. Historians have gone back into the financial records and the land ownership records of many southern states to try to determine just how many of these plantation owners there were in southern society, and try to determine how many people in the South actually owned slaves and in what proportions. And that research has been done largely since the 1970s. And we seem to have some pretty reliable numbers at this point. And so here's some of the stats. 75% of white Southerners owned 0 slaves. They didn't have the money or the amount of land necessary. So 75% of the American Southern white population would either own no land themselves, were working as a wage worker on someone else's farm, or own such a small farm, a little family farm, that they were mostly growing food for their family's own survival and selling what little they had left over for extra cash at market. So they didn't have the financial resources to buy slaves. About 17% of white Southerners owned very few slaves, 1 to 10. So we have about the wealthiest 25% or so that own slaves. The rest are economically cut out. So about 17% own 1 to 10, so very few, which means they probably have maybe 10 or 20 acres on their farm. So they have enough money to invest in a few slaves. 7% owns under 100, or 10 to 100. So those are the people who may own a few hundred acres. But the gigantic plantations that tend to dominate our historical memory of what the South looked like back then is really just the richest of the rich. Not just the richest 1%, but the richest 1/10 of 1% are the gigantic landowners who own hundreds of slaves. And it's usually that richest 7% or so that are the politically powerful. They're the ones who have money to run for office and serve as senators or congressmen or governors or state assemblymen or something like that. The mass majority of the Southern population are out of politics. They get to vote, but they're not usually running for office themselves. So that opens a gigantic question. Why would the Southern population be so supportive of slavery when so few of them actually own slaves? And why would the Southern population eventually fight the Civil War, right? If 75% don't own any slaves, why do they want to go to war to defend slavery? It's not in their economic interest. In fact, it's in the economic interest of their competitors, right? Why would they? I mean, these are the average soldiers who go off and join the Confederate armies and get slaughtered. Why are they willing to go fight? It's not their money on the line. There's a lot of questions about that. There's a lot of books written about what the soldiers talked about amongst themselves, what they wrote letters about, what they wrote in their diaries. So we can kind of glean some insights from the soldiers writing themselves to try to determine what they thought they were fighting for, what they thought was so important. And a lot of this really breaks down to social class. They tended to view themselves, even though they're cut out of the real money-making power of slavery, they viewed themselves as a unified white population, often a unified white Christian population, and really define themselves as different from the slave population, the black population, or other racial minorities. And they often talked about going out to defend the Southern way of life. There were predictions that if slavery was eradicated from the South, that the entire South would undergo an economic catastrophe, that this would destroy the Southern economy. And Southerners talked about that constantly. Wouldn't just destroy the Southern economy, but would destroy their culture, their whole society. They say that slavery is the kind of founding aspect of everything that the South was about. And if you kind of take out that linchpin, then you're going to have chaos. Probably an extreme thought, extreme justification for keeping slavery around. But that shows you how obsessive they were about protecting it. Do similar questions get asked today about why certain people go off and join the military to fight? Absolutely. Why is the U.S. military getting involved in all these foreign countries? It's often to defend natural resources or to control natural resources like oil. Do the average U.S. military servicemen and servicewomen, are they stock owners in ExxonMobil, or are they making profit off those companies? Not usually. So if their economic interest is not being defended by these invasions and these occupations and whatnot, why do the average American people go off and join the army? Doesn't seem to be their fight. Why not let the board of directors of ExxonMobil send their kids off to fight these wars? Which they don't, right? It's still an open question. And often my statement to students is, even in elections, in politics, figure out what's in your own economic interest and vote accordingly. Or what you want the country to look like, or figure out what you desire the country to be, and then figure out which party or which candidate most closely aligns with what you want or what's in your interest, and vote that way. Forget about who the politician is. Take the name and the label off and just look at the ideas, look at the policies, and vote for what you think is best. And 75% of the people vote in their own economic interest. You may see a very different politics and a whole lot of policy changes. But a lot of people don't do that. They vote for this stuff, right? They vote for their own social class, their own religious group, their own ethnicity. And that's an easy way that politicians and political parties have historically used to divide peoples and stay in power. So questions about any of those ideas? So, this isn't just stuff in a history textbook. This isn't just historical statistics. This kind of stuff is still important, very important today. Here's a kind of mapped breakdown of where the black population was mostly living in the United States around, let's see, map year on this thing. Jeez, no. I saw a year. But this is around the mid-1800s. Can't recall the exact year. Look it up again. But you can see that the gigantic proportion of the black population, which was entirely enslaved, was living in the South, and largely in the major cotton-producing states of the Deep South. Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, going over to Louisiana, Arkansas. So not much mystery there, because they were basically a captive population. There were certain groups that would try to free slaves and help them escape to the north and maybe eventually get into British Canada, which had completely outlawed slavery by this point, had done so in the 1820s, 1830s. So if they crossed the border into Canada, they would be completely free. So there's a lot of individual groups that tried to help southern black slaves to escape, not just into northern states, but to get them out of the country completely. And that was an outrage amongst southern white owners, obviously. They viewed it as their property being stolen. You don't have to write all this down. But the next section I want to talk about is the political debate that starts breaking down between North and South, especially in the 1850s. The original Constitution, written back in the way back by this point in the 1780s, did not mention the word slavery. It was a controversial topic, and so the writers avoided it, as much as politicians do today on almost any controversy. They don't want to give any kind of real opinion because they're afraid of angering any individual groups out there. So the Constitution did not address slavery by name. They used certain euphemisms for it, though. The clause that talks about importation calls them such persons as the states now existing shall think proper to admit, which is like a big scientific term. Everybody knew what it meant. It meant slaves. The migration or importation of new slaves shall not be prohibited by Congress until 1808, until 20 years later. So that literally says that Congress cannot pass a law to stop the importation of new slaves into the United States until, at the earliest, 1808. Why? Because that's 20 years later, and all these rich, old, white guys figured they'd either be dead or out of politics by then. So it wouldn't be their problem to solve or debate. So they pass it off onto the next generation. That doesn't mean that there's no statement on whether or not Congress has the power to outlaw slavery. This just talks about the importation of new slaves. And Article 5 goes on to say that no amendment will be made prior that affects the importation. The problem with that 20-year period, as James Madison predicted, was that the Southerners would come up with one argument after another to defend slavery even after 1808. And the states' rights argument rises within that time frame, where the Southerners largely say that each state is given the power under the Constitution to create its own property laws. And that seems to be justified in another part of the Constitution, some of the First Amendments, the 10th Amendment, part of the original Bill of Rights, that literally says any power is not specifically given to the United States federal government by the Constitution. Any powers that the U.S. government does not explicitly given in the Constitution automatically go back to the states or the individual people. So the Constitution does not mention property. Therefore, the individual states and city governments and whatnot get to write their own laws defining property. And guess what those southern states define property as in a lot of instances? Slaves. They define slaves as property. Just like you own a table, or a house, or a doorknob, or a gun, that's your property. Cannot be taken from you unless you're convicted of crime or something like that, or you have to pay a fine or something, some legal process. So they define slavery according to the same terms. It is just like any other kind of property. Your owning of other humans is your ownership of property, just like if you own a horse. And Southerners very frequently referred to their slaves as basically no better and no more important than horses or cattle, and often treated them accordingly. Kept them housed in pens, fed them food that we would think of basically food for lower level animals today. Gave them the bare necessities to survive. But the Southerners did have a constitutional argument, because once the 10th Amendment went in, that seemed to define and limit the amount of powers that the U.S. federal government, the national government in Washington, is allowed to have and use. And the definition of slavery was not mentioned, or the definition of property is not mentioned in the Constitution. So this goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, for decades. One person in Boston named Garrison starts basically a newspaper, a kind of popular newsletter that you could subscribe to. It's called The Liberator. And he starts first an abolitionist society in Boston in 1831, one of the first that is completely dedicated to ending slavery in the entire United States. Massachusetts had already outlawed it years and years before. So Garrison and his group, a voluntary citizen group, get together and they start organizing and raising money to lobby politicians on the national level and state levels to outlaw slavery. And Garrison is a very vocal public advocate to end slavery. He calls it the free labor ideology. Everybody should be free to do the work that they choose, and they should be free to negotiate for wages in the marketplace. And many free black people around Boston want to join his society. And many free black Northerners want to join his society to end slavery. Does he let them? No, because Garrison is also a racist. He wants to end slavery, but he does not consider black people to be the equal of whites. He does not think that they are intellectually capable of understanding high-level arguments and getting involved in these debates. So he still has this kind of separation in mind, and that the white population kind of has to take care of the black population because they're just not capable to take care of themselves. But he did want to end slavery, so that's the first step. And that was the view of many northern white people. Many of them are still racist. They don't want to see complete, full equality. They just want to see the end of slavery. So they still believe that racial minorities would have to work for white owners, and that they would basically still be a kind of child to the white parent, basically. And even people like Abraham Lincoln had that idea for quite a few years. Opposition to slavery, but not much of a consideration for the full kind of natural equality of the minorities. So it's very common in northern white culture, and remained very common for over a century. That was a controversial topic amongst liberal white northerners even in the 1960s. So a lot of those debates obviously continue even today. The Southern response to Garrison and a lot of other, as the abolitionist call and the abolitionist movement rises, especially around places like Boston and New York, the old cities, the commercial cities. The Southern response is that they're building factories in the North, and they're hiring a lot of white workers in those factories, and it's very well known that work in those factories is tedious and dangerous. If you have them get your arm ripped off by a machine, you'll just get fired and thrown out in the street. Maybe you'll starve to death because now you can't get a job. So the response from the Southern white population is, who are the white Northerners that talk? All these factory owners. They're basically treating their own population as a kind of slave. Factory slaves. What Karl Marx would eventually call wage slaves. People who work hard and never make enough money to really escape from that life. And they can never even save enough money to go to school. So the white Southerners say, yes, we do have black slaves, and yes, we do treat them as basically unequal, but at least we give them housing and food. So they draw a direct comparison to white factory labor in the North. And the white Southerners often portray their slaves as happy to be doing the work, and if they had the opportunity, they wouldn't even leave the plantation because they like it there so much. They have such close relations with the owner's family and whatnot. And they bring out the religious argument that slavery is permitted in parts of the Bible. So the white Southerners have a series of different responses to people like Garrison from the North. To justify slavery and say, what's the difference between factory labor in the North? The horrible things, the inhumane things that are happening in the North, and the inhumane things that are happening in the South. And a lot of Southerners start to feel that the Southern economy is basically a colony of the North. they're growing the raw materials for the northern factories. They're growing the raw cotton and a lot of the food and just sending it to the north, much like the Americans had made stuff when they were a colony of Britain and just shipped it all over to Britain to be made into stuff in the British factories. So there's a consistent complaint that's growing in the South that the Southern economy in general is oppressed by the North as a colony, and that maybe the Southerners should declare some kind of independence. So questions about any of these ideas? Are you too busy checking your Facebook status or something? So I see the phones are out there. Evil little machines. Or, machines aren't evil, right? It's what we do with machines. That's the real kind of ethical problem. Does that make sense? Atomic power by itself is not, it can be used in good ways to generate electricity, but how dangerous is that? It's another topic. But we can use atomic power to either create electricity or to create bombs. It's not a fault of atomic power. It's the fault of our own decision making, right? So, technology is not evil in and of itself. It's or bad or good, or any of those kind of ethical distinctions in and of itself. It's the human decision making. Okay, so that's a lot of the kind of public and political debate going up into the early 1800s. And this is also reinforced by what the U.S. government had done in the Missouri Compromise, which was to literally draw a line across the country and say that areas south of the line would be open to slavery and areas north of the line would not. So a lot of the just U.S. government's own actions eventually reinforced a growing distinction between North and South, anti-slavery movements in the North and pro-slavery defense in the South. So the Missouri Compromise had a lot to do with this. In 1820, they thought that they had possibly solved the long-term problem. By drawing this line. But this Missouri Compromise is largely destabilized by the War with Mexico. Because all of a sudden, now the United States has taken all this land all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and what are you going to do about that land? That becomes the next conflict. So we've seen this slide before, right? With the definition of the Missouri Compromise. Okay. So this becomes what the United States starts looking like by the late 1840s, after the War with Mexico and all that territory had been taken in. Florida had been added along with some other what we today call the Midwestern states, like Iowa, Wisconsin, and whatnot. So a lot of these areas are being incorporated. And the Missouri Compromise line continued along the 3630 parallel and theoretically would continue all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But very quickly after the War with Mexico, California has enough of a population to become a state largely because of the gold rush in the mid-1840s. Gold was discovered around the Sacramento, San Francisco areas. So that just caused a wave of immigration into those areas, literally to strike it rich. Dig in the ground, find some gold, be rich forever if you survive the robbers. So California quickly starts talking about entering the United States as an official state. There is no history of slavery in California because California was a province and area of Mexico, and Mexico had outlawed slavery from its founding. So there was no slavery in California by the time it moves to become a state. So a new compromise will have to be reached, and this will be called the Compromise of 1850. But this debate, even before California forces the compromise, grows and grows and grows. So you don't have to, again, write all this down. These are more quotes from the Constitution. The Northerners, in their abolitionist attempt, they call themselves the Free Soilers, the abolitionists. There's a lot of different terms. They say that the Congress has the power under the Constitution to make laws for the territories. Because now there's just all these open territories out there that have been conquered from Mexico that someone's going to have to decide, are these going to be open to slavery or not? So the Northerners say Congress should decide, which basically means that since the northern population is much larger than the South, the Northerners will decide, because they have more politicians in Congress. They have more votes. So they constantly quote one section of Article 4 that says Congress has power to make all the rules and regulations respecting the territory of the United States. So U.S. territories fall under the authority of Congress to make laws. They don't have state governments yet, so someone has to make laws for them. Therefore, theoretically, Congress would decide whether or not these territories will be open to slavery. And when it comes down to the vote, the northern population has more votes in Congress. The Southerners don't like that idea very much. They argue instead that Congress, when the Constitution was written, the Constitution brought together the many states under an idea of state equality. So the Southern perspective is to say that, well, Congress shouldn't be deciding this stuff. The states should maybe figure out another way of deciding it. Because the territories are the common property of all the states in combination. So the Southerners are trying to avoid the argument as much as they possibly can. Because if it just goes to a vote in Congress, they're going to lose. They know it. They don't have the numbers. And the really only one place where the Southerners had enough votes to stop laws from being passed was in the Senate, because they still have that delicate 50-50 balance of senators. So there's an exact number of senators from the North as there are senators from the South. And every time a new state comes in, they have to come in twos, basically, for quite a few decades. They have to come in with a partner from the other part of the country. So when Florida comes in, there has to be a northern partner to uphold the balance. And that was a Southern demand. So the Southerners have a lot of different, they use a lot of different labels, fire eaters, some start calling them like conservative groups and whatnot. And they become known as fire eaters because they argue very powerfully and very emotionally to continue slavery. And even if the U.S. Congress votes to eliminate it from the territories, when you look at the territories, if the U.S. Congress votes to not allow slavery in any of the territories conquered from Mexico, then as those territories become states, combined with the northern Louisiana Purchase territory, eventually there will be more non-slave senators than there were pro-slavery senators in the existing southern states. Does that make sense? And eventually they can just pass the law in a few decades. All they need is a majority. So the Southerners are desperately trying to hold on to that equal 50-50 balance. They see it in the Senate as the only thing that is going to stop just Congress waking up one day and writing a law that eradicates slavery from the whole country. So you have on one side the Northerners, who many of those groups look to stop slavery from expanding to the territories, and the Southern groups that want to see slavery expand to the territories as much as possible to guarantee the long-term 50-50 balance. And that's the giant kind of crux of the debate. And it will be throughout the 1850s. It will be even under President Lincoln. The debate is over whether to allow slavery to be extended into all these territories or not. And a compromise is proposed. some politicians speak up and say, why not let the people in the territory decide? Let them have a vote whether or not they want to have slavery or not. This becomes known as popular sovereignty. Popular meaning people, sovereignty meaning they make the law. Pretty simple. They have the power. So this idea comes forth that just allow a territory in California or New Mexico or what becomes Arizona, let them have a vote as a territory, just the people living there, whether or not they want to have slavery, and that will decide it. Therefore, Congress doesn't have to intervene and just go according to what the people demand. There are some major problems with that idea even. Anyone think of problems with that plan? Yeah.
People could move in.
Exactly. When do you have the vote? Do you have the vote when only a few thousand people live there? When it's first becoming a territory? Do you have the vote the year before they apply for statehood, which would basically announce that if you want to see slavery extended or stopped, move into that area, become a registered voter, and try to tip the balance in your side's favor? It's a gigantic problem. So even the compromise had systematic logistical problems with it that eventually would even destroy this ability to compromise. But with California coming in, they eventually, in 1850, create the Compromise of 1850 that has three major steps to it. And the politicians that voted on this in the Senate and in the House, and the President signed off on it, to allow California to become a state, saw this as really no other way. California comes in as a free state. It is the only state that comes in at this point. Therefore, the anti-slavery North will now have 2 more senators than the South. And that scares the South to no end. So the Northerners are getting what they want. They're bringing a new state in, a non-slave state. And the compromise is the rest of the territories conquered from Mexico in the war. Texas had already come in. But the so-called Utah and New Mexico territories, all that open land will be open to popular sovereignty. So the Compromise of 1850 wipes out the Missouri Compromise line. Right? It doesn't extend west anymore. Those 2 territories, the Utah and New Mexico territories, will have a vote whether or not they want to have slavery in their territory. So whether, depending on how the vote turns out, the non-slave territories could extend all the way down to the Mexican border, or the pro-slave territories can now extend all the way up to Oregon. And the Southerners get stronger so-called fugitive slave laws, which means that slaves that ran away in the South and tried to get to the North to escape. When they get into the North, a lot of the northern state governments and city governments just looked the other way and allowed those so-called fugitives, escaped property, to literally go to Canada or to even live in northern states without being bothered. So the fugitive slave laws are now announced, where the U.S. federal government has to track down runaway slaves from the South and capture them and bring them back to their so-called owners. So the Compromise of 1850 does a lot of very important things, and it's very controversial. And it really puts off the decision on slavery for another day. Again, as politicians today are saying, they kick the can down the road and wait for the next generation to solve the problem. So it avoids a possible outbreak of secession or civil war or infighting, rebellion, or whatever you want to call it, in the 1850s by simply passing the debate on slavery off to the next few years. The problems of the Compromise are pretty extreme. When the Compromise was proposed, northern the Whig Party largely splits between a northern faction that wants to vote against it because it doesn't want to see the possible spread of slavery into new areas, and a southern Whig Party that votes for it because they do want to see the expansion of slavery. So this splits the Whig Party to the point where it basically kills the party. The Whigs had come from north and south in opposing the Democratic Party at that point. When the Compromise of 1850 hits, the Whig politicians now split between Northerners and Southerners. So the Whig Party finds it almost impossible to win elections. And the Whig Party goes out of existence very quickly in the next few election cycles. So with the Whig Party virtually disappearing within about 4 years, they are eradicated. There is no opposition party in Washington, D.C., so the Democratic Party takes power. The presidents of those years are all going to be Democrats. Most of the senators and people in Congress and the House of Representatives are Democrats. So you start seeing a political split that is not so much anymore Democrat versus an opposition party, but it starts looking much more North versus South. And the eventual party that rises to oppose the Democrats in elections is a Republican Party that is basically started as a northern anti-slavery party. So the Republican Party doesn't even often make it onto the ballot in the South. So as the Republicans rise as an anti-slavery, very liberal party, right? I mean, if you define liberalism as trying to change things, you cannot have any bigger change in society than the eradication of slavery. The Republican Party is the radical liberal party of that time. They want to bring massive changes to U.S. economics and society. And as the Republican Party starts winning elections in the mid-1850s, they basically take control, political control in the North. There is a split in the country, which is basically three-way. The South will be dominated by the Democrats, because the Republican Party is an anti-slave party for the most part. So, the southern states won't even put Republican candidates on their ballots in a lot of instances. So the Democrats largely come from the South. They are pro-slavery Democratic Party members. And in the North, you get a split between the anti-slavery Republicans and the more moderate Democrats. The Southern politicians continue looking into Latin America, specifically the Caribbean islands, places like Cuba, as ripe for a conquest to get more states built. And eventually that'll lead to an invasion of Cuba that eventually even brings Puerto Rico into the United States as a territory. And if anyone noticed last week, Puerto Rico had a vote whether or not to try to become the 51st state, the newest state in the United States. And they voted yes. A slim majority, I think 55% or so. But there's going to be a debate in Washington, D.C. about whether or not to make Puerto Rico into the 51st state. It's been a territory for a long time, for over 100 years. Another major problem is that now the federal government is going to be forced to hunt down runaway slaves and bring them back to their southern owners. And another major problem is that just doesn't solve the question of slavery. They have kicked the debate down the road a little. Because as it becomes, the debate becomes much more violent over time, there are threats of civil war, that the country would split in two. And a lot of politicians in the 1850s didn't want to have to address this stuff. So a question about the compromise at all. It avoided the war in 1850, but it created long-term consequences, largely the rise of the Republican Party that will fight the war, and will fight the war in a very dedicated way. So the Republican Party, I think they run their first presidential candidate in 1852, maybe 56. He loses, so you get another Democratic president elected. One of the most popular politicians of this time that was trying to figure out a way to keep the country together, unified, and tried to solve the question of slavery, is named Stephen Douglas. He's a senator from Illinois. And he was a national level politician. I've been in the Senate for a while. And he wants to run for the presidency. He is in the Democratic Party. He wants to come up with some kind of national policy that would overcome the debate over slavery. And he hits on the idea of bringing the Industrial Revolution and the rise of big cities to the new territories that have been acquired in the West. And he says to do that, you have to start building railroads from the eastern cities to connect his vision of these new cities in the West. And that railroad, he wants it to run through northern areas because the railroad brings prosperity and a lot of wealth. So he wants it to run through areas like Kansas and even possibly even his own home state of Illinois. And he uses this as his policy, his promise. Elect me president and this is what I want to do. And he believed that this would reunify the people so that they could overcome their divisions over slavery and focus on something else. The problem with his attempt to run for the presidency is he's in the Democratic Party, therefore he has to get a lot of Southerners on his side, right? Because if the Southern states vote against him in the nominating process, then he's not going to get the nomination, so he's not going to be the Democratic nominee for president. So he has to give the South something in order to get their support. And since the Republicans are a new rising party, they're not all that organized at first, Douglas realizes if he gets the nomination, he'll probably win the office. He'll become president. And Douglas is probably one of the very, very few national politicians that had enough fame and, are generally recognized by the population as being a major political leader that could have reunified the country. The country is very heavily divided, and a lot of politicians are famous for pushing the division. So Douglas is one of the few who talks about unity going forward. The problem with his candidacy, again, is he has to get Southern support. And in order to get that Southern support, when he brings his bill, his proposed law to Congress, what eventually becomes the Kansas-Nebraska Act of '54, his cookie to the southern part of the country is to expand popular sovereignty. He was very much believed in popular sovereignty. He thought that was the way out of the slavery debate. Allow the territories to vote for themselves. So he places the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which literally means going to build the railroad probably through Kansas. Therefore, Kansas has to be organized as a state. So that puts the debate on whether or not to expand slavery into Kansas front and center. And his solution is to allow popular sovereignty into virtually any territory that is not yet a state. Oregon is getting ready to come in, but the Oregon country had already been kind of declared by previous laws to be non-slave areas. California's in, so this really breaks down to New Mexico and Utah had already been open to popular sovereignty by the Compromise of 1850. So this new compromise in 1854 is expanding popular sovereignty all the way up to the Canadian border in Kansas and Nebraska into those territories. So this is the final nail in the coffin of the Missouri Compromise. That wipes out that old line that said, non-slavery to the north, slavery to the south. And popular sovereignty in these new territories that Douglas had to propose in order to get Southern support for his candidacy for president brought the possibility of slavery expanding into the Louisiana Purchase territory, which up to that point was off limits. So Southerners are very happy with this, pro-slavery Southerners, because they want to win the vote in all four of these territories, and therefore, in their mind, get slavery into all those areas, and when those areas are carved up into new states, you may get more slave states than free states. Therefore, slavery will be upheld in the Senate, possibly forever. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act also propels the Republican Party forward to try to stop these things. So you have these two groups, the two divided groups, ironically under an attempt at unity, really convinces the two major political parties to go to political warfare against each other. And the first territory that's going to vote on this is going to be Kansas. They have the largest population of all these territories, so they're going to take the first territorial vote. And just like today, a lot of people believe that when that first territory votes, the outcome of that election will convince the rest of the people in other territories how to vote, right? That starts a snowball process, where if you win one election, you're likely to win the next. Does that make sense? And Kansas will take the first vote, and people start flooding into Kansas to try to win the vote for their side. Eventually, more Southerners flood into Kansas to try to vote to get Kansas to be a slave territory and eventually a slave state. And that starts a certain amount of open warfare in Kansas that we'll get to next time. We'll stop here. And we'll talk next time about the political and military conflicts in the 1850s.